welcome to the Lineage of Liar Game here at Desucon 2026 in summer. It's a little on the rainy side outside, so why not be in here enjoying a nice warm room and a nice warm reception. Lovely to have you all here. I'm Sean, and I've been coming to Desucon for closing on 10 years pretty soon, maybe the next one or two, and I come from Ireland, and that's why this presentation is in English. So I live in Ireland, I fly over for Desucon twice a year because it's awesome and you're a great community, and I just love being here. So it is a fantastic thing to get to contribute a little bit to the esteemed Desucon program every once in a while. I've got a little disclaimer for you. This presentation is in English. It is also for entertainment purposes only. And the reason is that lineages are very big things. So if we tried to cover everything that contributed to Liar Game and what makes it what it is, we'd be here for a very long time. So instead, I'm focusing on a few things that I think make Liar Game just special. And so it is upon me to introduce what is Liar Game for anyone who hasn't come across it previously. Liar Game is a manga by Shinobu Kaitani. It came out in 2005 and has just recently started airing as an anime. So it has had a magical resurgence 15 years later, 20 years later, and is now getting in front of audiences for the first time, for wider audiences for the first time, and that makes me very excited. And in terms of its genre, most people would look at Liar Game and say, well, that's a high-stakes game manga, psychological drama, chess masters playing the pieces against each other and finding ways to win against all the odds. And the general theme of Liar Game is that it's ordinary people who've been given 100 million yen in a suitcase, and they're encouraged to try and steal the suitcase of another player, and things go wrong somewhere along the way, and they end up potentially in debt. But it's okay, as long as you come and play the Liar Game. And we're going to find who is the ultimate liar through this process. Now, Shinobu Kaitani, the author of Liar Game, had written prior to Liar Game a manga called One Outs, which is very much in the psychological games territory. So a lot of the manga, like Kaiji and Akagi, as we were mentioning, would come from a lineage which is already familiar to our mangaka, so it's not really the focus for this presentation. Instead, we're going to look at a few other things which have contributed to what makes Liar Game into such a special and interesting manga. And one of those things is the context in which it came to be. So I mentioned the year 2005, and it's an important year, because Liar Game is one of a number of manga which are a response to the zeitgeist in Japan of that era. In the late 1980s, the Japanese government and Japanese society is racked with scandal. There's a lot of corruption in the government. In particular, we have a scandal or a series of scandals called the Recruit scandal. Putting it simply, there's a HR firm in Japan, it's called Recruit. The person who runs it gives a whole bunch of unlisted shares to various politicians and other important people. Eventually, the company goes public and those shares become very valuable, and somebody notices and says, hang on, those politicians are taking money under the table, that's not cool. And the entirety of Japanese society is racked with distress and betrayal, because that's not how public servants are supposed to behave. And the result of this scandal, and then a later wave of scandals in the early year 2000, and that decade, is that there's a number of manga which come out and they have a very direct response to what has been happening on the ground in Japan. So the first of these that we're going to talk about a little bit is Sanctuary, and that comes out in 1990, right after the Recruit scandal and those waves. And in the year 2000, we end up with Death Note, Akametsu, and Liar Game, which are three manga that have a similar feeling of disappointment with the contemporary Japanese government and telling stories about how people might bring about change. The first of these is Sanctuary, and it's a manga that is quite a long one, very cool. It's about two people who are both very much against the way the Japanese government has been doing things. And the manga is not fictionalizing things, so the LDP is in this manga, and some of its politicians are thinly veiled versions of them are in the manga. and show up as characters, and you get to see the corruption very firsthand, very visceral, in how that's portrayed. So one of our characters decides to take the path of the light and gets into politics. They start joining a party, they start gathering people around them, they start running for election and campaigning and doing all that kind of stuff. While on the other side, we have another character who takes the path of shadow and decides to join the Yakuza and try to wrest control of Japan through the underworld. And these two characters are playing against a system which is already quite entrenched and has multiple sides and facets to it. But they're also racing against each other in a way. And so Sanctuary is it's a long story, and it takes course over decades, because if you want to tell this kind of political drama, you do need a lot of time to go through the various developments, the election cycles, and so forth. So decades pass within this story as these characters reach the conclusion that they're ultimately after, which is to turn Japan into a place of sanctuary for themselves, and hopefully for many other people, that it would be a different kind of society, a more inclusive society, a more welcoming society, or more a better place to be. The next one that I'll talk about is Akametsu. And Akametsu is you can almost tell from the cover, right? Like, it's a more violent, it's a more energetic, and frankly, it's quite gory as manga go. And Akametsu has a similar kind of energy, but it's presented in a very different way. So the story of Akametsu starts with a live broadcast on TV of a Japanese politician who's being interviewed on television. And he's talking about some of the decisions that he made. I think he's recently retired. And one of the audience members stands up and runs up to the stage and points a gun to this guy's head. And he says, this guy's a fucking liar. And you know what? You know it. You know it. You know it, you know it, you know it. Everyone in this room knows that this man lies. Everyone knows that he cheats, he's corrupt. And for years, I have sat on my hands and I've watched him through the television screen, and I've done nothing. And what I've come to realize is that I still have my hands, I still have my feet. And so, today this man is put to death. And so that you know that I'm taking it seriously, that this isn't just a joke, that this isn't radicalism, I'm betting my own life on it too. Kills the politician, kills himself on live television, and it creates obviously a huge wave of shock in Japan. And it starts a movement which is founded on this idea of akametsu, or divine killing, where politicians ultimately are outnumbered by the people that they serve. And if they're that bad, if they're that corrupt, that the ordinary person can rise up and say, actually, I can make this difference, I can make this change, and I can see through justice. And I think for most of us, we can see that there's some problems with that. Maybe that doesn't scale very well. Maybe there's some people who are just quite radical and would take advantage of the situation. And the manga actually deals with all that stuff. So it goes through, okay, suppose this kind of wave of dissatisfaction with corrupt politicians was to kick off. What happens when you get your copycats? What happens when you get people who are messing around or trying to do interesting things with it? So it's quite gory. And there's the story takes maybe a different direction than you might expect as it starts out. But it's pretty cool. And it's definitely something that comes from a lineage of dissatisfaction with how things were being done in contemporary Japan at the time. And that brings us to Death Note. I almost don't need to introduce Death Note. Hands up if you know Death Note. Yeah. Death Note is does absolutely nothing to hide that it's not very happy with how the justice system in Japan was working. In fact, one would say it's quite dissatisfied. And so a character gets the power to enact change on society and have that kind of impact, and of course pursues that to the fullest. And that brings us to Liar Game, which again, this started in 2005, so it's about a year later, but the mangaka is finishing up their previous manga one out, so it's definitely still part of that wave. And this is an opportunity for us to think a little bit about what Liar Game is and what it's like. And it's a little bit unusual because it starts out very clearly like this is a high-stakes game. There's psychology, people are being threatened with death. And a little unusually, the organizers of the game are kind of in the background. They don't get the focus of the story. Often, in a high-stakes game, the organizers are either completely hidden, or they're quite cruel, and they're like the Yakuza, they're criminals, they're very mean and unkind. In Liar Game, the organizers of the Liar Game tournament, as it were, are polite, cordial. They're in the room, they don't talk to you much, but they're there, they're present, and they just help things move along. And so the players end up more focused on the game itself. And to introduce just a few of the characters in Liar Game, the first is Kanzaki Now. And when she's introduced in the story, the first thing that we learn about her is that her name in kanji pretty much means honest person. Very direct, very straightforward. And that's exactly how she lives her life. So she's the kind of person who sees a 100 yen coin on the pavement and picks it up and goes to the police office to hand it in. So very, very, very straightforward and honest and direct in her way of doing things. And it helps greatly for her that she is paired often with Akiyama, who is one of these con men geniuses. Very, very clever, very good at pulling the strings, figuring out how to play the games and all the strategy stuff. So now and Akiyama kind of end up as a pairing very early on in these games and end up working together. And if it were not for Akiyama, one could say that Now would probably be saddled with debt and out of the game very quickly. There's also the wonderful Yokoya. And he is definitely a very smart guy. He has a pet mouse that he brings around with him all the time. He's one of the adversaries, if not the adversary, in many respects. And I really like this character. And I like his confrontation with Now that happens quite early in the series. So after they've kind of played a game and he's seen how Now works as this very honest, well-to-do person, he tells her, Now, I don't like you. I don't fucking like you. And the reason is, you don't doubt the things that people say. You just take it all at face value. And if you don't doubt people, if you don't have doubts about them, then that's like not really caring about who the person really is. If you're just like going through life reading the covers of all the books and pretending like you have knowledge, that's just not the real thing. So Yokoya not only is a smart guy, but he makes it his personal mission to see that Now ends up saddled in debt and has to learn a proper fucking lesson about life because like this. I should have mentioned there will be some cursing because I do that, I'm Irish, that happens. So he's a really interesting character and has a very good dynamic with Now, which when I was reading that at the time, I thought, wow, that's kind of profound. Because if you aren't doubting other people on some level and you're just accepting them at face value, are you really doing the work? Are you actually trying to get to know those people? And are you curious enough to ask the questions? We also come across some of the Liar Game tournament office. So Liranira is one of the more distinguished and visible ones. They all wear masks. They're very cordial, polite. They kind of stay in the background for the most part. And what happens is, in Liar Game, the rounds kind of continue over time. The players have their wins, they have their losses, they continue to the next rounds. And now Kanzaki becomes a really interesting character because she doesn't start lying. In a sense, she kind of defies the game. She becomes a very interesting chess piece on the board because everyone starts to realize that if Now says something, she really believes it. And that means she's really the only character where if she says something, you can believe that she thinks it's true. So she gets manipulated, she gets betrayed. But she sticks to her guns and says, actually, I'm going to be the character I'm going to be the person who rises above this game, doesn't become a liar, and the other characters really have to shape their strategies around her because the level of trust that she has and her willingness to take her winnings and use it to buy other people back into the game instead of saddling them with debt earns her a lot of trust. So we've got this twist on a high-stake game where not all of the characters are just chess masters trying to win. We also have this character who's presented as, okay, I'm going to be a more normal human being in this scenario. I'm just going to reject the whole thing where we cheat and lie and try to ruin each other. But you might have one honest character, but the rest of the characters, right? The rest of the characters are going to be selfish, aren't they? Because we all know that humans are brutal savages deep down. We're made of bad stuff under there. There's only this thin veneer of civility on top of a kind of being sinners or something underneath. And if you had that 100 million debt that was pending, wouldn't you do the same? Wouldn't you betray? Wouldn't you lie? And this is where Liar Game, I think, we need to bring another lineage into the story. Quotes, quotes, quotes. Our nature is not only destitute and empty of good, but so fertile and fruitful of every evil that it cannot be idle. This from John Calvin. For this can be said of men in general, that they are ungrateful, fickle hypocrites, Machiavelli. And we are descended from an endless series of generations of murderers, Sigmund Freud. Not the most uplifting interpretation of humanity, one could say. And this is a little bit of a description of veneer theory, which is this idea that somewhere at the heart of humans, we're all quite selfish creatures, and we're descended from apes or whatever, and we're going to do whatever it takes to survive because survival of the fittest. But we have this thing called civilization, so that just at the very outermost layer, if you put a thin bit of paint on top of humans, you can get a bit of civilization, and people are nice to each other and they get along and they can coexist. And veneer theory, the Greeks had their version of this. The medieval era had their version of this. The modern version is the one that I think is interesting to look at because it's the one that's actually informing how we think as a modern society. And in that, there's a couple of key things which are worth mentioning. So the first is the Lord of the Flies. Then we've got Stanford's prison experiment, Milgram shock experiment, Self-Esteem by Richard Dawkins, and there's various other things that follow along, but these are good ones to look at. Generally speaking, are these familiar to you? Raise your hand. Yes. Overwhelmingly, we have come across some of these things. So Lord of the Flies, for anyone who doesn't know, is a book that was written in 1954, or published in 1954. And it's a story about a group of young British schoolboys who end up stranded on an island together. And on the first day, the boys come together and say, well, we'd all like to get rescued. That would be good. So let's come up with some rules, do this in a nice, sensible way, keep a fire going so that we get smoke signals, and hopefully a boat will come by and we'll get off the island. Well, a couple of weeks later, the survivor gets picked up and bemoans, what is it about human nature that is so cruel that we couldn't figure out how to get things to work, because the boys descend into madness and bullying each other and doing all sorts of nasty things. And it was a huge sensation at the time. And part of the reason it's a huge sensation at the time is that a couple of years previously, Nazi Germany was defeated. And a lot of truth and revelation was coming out about what the Nazis were doing and how that was working, and how many ordinary people, seemingly ordinary people, were doing this awful stuff. And there started to become questions of, is there like a Nazi inside all of us just waiting to creep out? I hope not. But stories like this captured the public imagination, and people started asking questions of themselves. The Stanford prison experiment was a similar one in the sense that, or this was a scientific experiment, so a Stanford professor says, I'm going to get a bunch of students, I'm going to give some of them the role of prison guard, I'm going to give some of them the role of prisoners, and we're just going to see what that looks like for 2 weeks. And it didn't last 2 weeks, it lasted 6 days. There's some footage of what happens, and it descends into madness very quickly. And so the word that gets out to the wider world is, hey, you can put people in the role of a prison guard, and suddenly they take advantage of the situation. They're awful and they're cruel and they're nasty. And we also have Milgram's shock experiment. And this is one where you bring somebody into a room, you sit them down, and you say, here's the shock machine. There's a fellow behind the curtain there, and I'd like you to administer shocks to them because we're testing pain tolerance. We're doing it in the name of science. So the person administers the 10 volts, move the dial, 15 volts, 20 volts. And at some point, the person, they're hearing screams and shouts from the other side of the ouch, ouch, and then it turns into screams and make it stop and this kind of thing. And the question is, how far will the person go in terms of continuing to hit the button and shock the other person? Now, we know that there's no person on the other side. It's an actor. There's no actual pain. But over here, this person thinks that they're administering an electric shock, and at some point, most of them do end up stopping before going for the maximum voltage. But the unfortunate and harrowing thing is that people do administer a lot of shocks to seemingly another human, which is kind of awful. And there's footage of it, and it doesn't look good. It doesn't look good at all. So these are the kinds of things which are informing how we think about ourselves as humans. These kind of results are affirming a kind of belief that many of us have grown up with or learned on TV or whatever else it is that says, hey, deep down inside, humans are, you got to be careful of people because we need like a civilization, otherwise people would descend into chaos very quickly. So controversy and bad news tend to spread, and these experiments in particular were happening in the 60s at a time when people were having a lot of questions about the Nazi regime and so forth. And that is really held true today. Like, we've all still heard of those experiments and have ideas about them. But I'd like to share a different side of this lineage, which is based on a book called Humankind by Rutger Bregman. This is a cool book. I really enjoyed reading this. And the reason it's so interesting is it explores a different side to a lot of the things which inform veneer theory and is in ways a critique of veneer theory. So I'm going to share some of that because I think it's really interesting. And it talks through some of those examples and gives a perspective on what maybe really was going on in some of those experiments. And the first one is around Lord of the Flies. Lord of the Flies was written by a British schoolteacher who had never been on a voyage, never been lost on an island. It's just a made-up story about, I'm frustrated with these kids that I teach in school. And the dude, he beat his kids. He was not necessarily a very nice person. So there's reasons to not be buying into the made-up story that is Lord of the Flies and treating that as the reality. But perhaps the best refutation is that this thing actually happened. There was a real-life Lord of the Flies in the 1960s. And it happened in this tiny little island off the coast of Australia called Tonga, where a group of 6 boys decided, you know what? Don't really want to go to school next week. And they grab somebody's boat and they get on the ship and they're trying to go over to the neighboring island. They do not get to the neighboring island. They end up adrift at sea for 8 days. They end up in this tiny uninhabited little rock called Atta. And they're there for 15 months before they get picked up and rescued. But the thing is, they were actually fine. They became fast friends, they worked together, they had disagreements. When there were disagreements, you'd send the 2 people to opposite end of the island for a couple hours, then come back. And they were very cooperative. They managed to keep a fire going. They managed to do all the right stuff. And they lived and they're alive at the time that this book was published. So if you leave humans on an island by themselves with no civilization, well, the thing that actually happens is they work together and they figure out how to make it work, which is quite uplifting, I would say. Similarly, if you look at a reproduction of the Stanford prison experiment, there's a lot of issues with the Stanford prison experiment. So one of the key things about that experiment is supposed to be that the prison guards are not given instructions about how to behave. The dude who ran it gave them very clear instructions. You are to be really nasty to those prisoners because we are studying stress tolerance in humans. So he gave them a lot of encouragement, like, hey, you need to be a jerk about this. You need to be a really awful prison guard to those people. And as a result, it is not a fair experiment. When you actually run this experiment, so the BBC did this in the early 2000s, they did 4 episodes and they decided, this sucks. It's really boring. Because what happens is, the prisoners broke out at one point and then they just went and played cards with the guards. There isn't a natural setting or a default setting where humans end up just having a go at each other under these type of circumstances. The Milgram shock machine experiment has a whole bunch of issues with it as well. And Milgram himself in his personal notes kind of wrote down at the time, I'm not sure whether I've kind of advanced science or just put together a bunch of theatrics. But the thing is, the reproductions of his shock experiment actually held. So it is possible to bring humans into a room and have them administer shocks, seemingly to another human, and they'll do it. And there's a really interesting thing that we learn about that I'll come back to later. But I wanted to bring up another experiment that starts in the 60s, which is even more interesting. And this experiment took place in Russia. And the idea at the time was there was a Russian scientist. I want to get the Russian scientist's name because they did some pretty great work. Dmitry Bevelev and Limudia Trut. I'm getting those names horribly mispronounced. Sorry for anyone who could speak Russian in the audience. Please forgive me. Dmitry is reading through some of the writings of Charles Darwin. And the writings of Charles Darwin include a couple of notes about domestic animals. And he says, when you look at dogs compared to wolves, there are certain characteristics which humans seem to have bred for, or bred the dogs for. And you notice that they have kind of shorter snouts, they have droopier ears. The younger ones often have these kind of white spots on their fur. If you look at pigs compared to wild boars, you see that they're a few sizes smaller. They tend to have curly tails. And Darwin was kind of curious. He's like, I don't know why farmers bred for that. Like if you're choosing which animals you're going to breed for, you maybe go for more meat or other things, why the curly tails? It just seems weird. And Dimitri decided, I've actually got an idea about this. I think it might not be the case that they were being selected for curly tails, but they were being selected for some other trait, and that trait happens to have some side effects on the physique of the creature. So Dimitri goes and gets a train to the middle of Siberia. At the time, it's a communist government. He doesn't tell them. This is a secret experiment, like a legit secret experiment. And himself and his colleague Lymidia start an experiment where they find these lovely creatures called silver foxes. Silver foxes have never been tamed. They're very wild, they're very aggressive. And so Dimitri and the team get a bunch of these in cages, like hundreds of cages, and they decide to selectively breed and do generation to see what's going to happen if you select for friendliness. Now, friendliness with a silver fox is like you put on your protective glove and you put your hand into the cage, and if it hesitates before it bites you, that's friendly. That's friendly. Very good. You're going to be in part of the next generation. Your genes are getting passed on. The ones who didn't hesitate, like, okay, you can go back to the wild or something. And for 20 years, they kept up this experiment in total secret until the 80s, when the Russian Politburo had changed and they were more interested in promoting Russian science. And then Dimitri and the crew are able to demonstrate the following. They tamed these creatures, or they managed to engineer tame silver foxes, which had never been seen. Like, you could show footage of this. And they were now in a position where they could do the before and the after, like what's different across these creatures. And what it came down to, among other things, was increased levels of serotonin and oxytocin, which are two of the hormones that are in flow through all mammals. And they could see that, okay, you do see some of the physical characteristics change, but it's the hormone levels that are playing a really big impact in this, or there may be something a little further down the chain that's informing the hormone levels. So this was an amazing discovery. And the question that follows that is, well, if you can see this with pigs, and you can see it with wolves, and you can see it with foxes, can you see it with humans? Is there a domesticated variation of humans? And the answer is yes, there is. Back many, many hundreds of thousands of years ago, we had a forebearer, or a species that was living alongside us, called Neanderthals. There were a couple of different Homo various things, but if we look at the Neanderthals, we found their skulls, we know a fair bit about them. Their brain size was about 15% larger than ours. We often think about like Neanderthals as like a knuckle-dragging idiot type of thing, and I guess they didn't have the civilization built up, but they were smarter. Like, they had more raw processing power than we would have had. So it creates this question of like, well, why did humans survive when Neanderthals had some pretty serious evolutionary advantages? Because if we're smart, I mean, Neanderthals would have been a fair bit smarter. And what we can see from looking at the way that evolution panned out is that humans actually, in terms of like the facial shape, the bone structure, and so forth, we have the similar kind of domesticated features relative to Neanderthal that a dog would have relative to a wolf. And that, like, a way of looking at that is that the thing that helped humans to survive when Neanderthals did not, there's some extent it's going to be maybe humans are better adapted to the climate, but the really key thing was we're more social. We're more willing to work with other people. We're more able to form a tribe. We're more able to share new technologies and ideas with each other. So maybe a Neanderthal comes up with the idea of fishing using a spear, but he doesn't tell everyone. And therefore, even if they come up with it more often, they're not sharing it to the broader population. Humans share ideas, they learn from each other. And that has played a huge role in our evolutionary success. And if you look at the way that chimpanzees, orangutans, and other primates learn things, and you compare them to a 2-year-old human toddler, the chimps have a pretty similar score on various learning tests to the toddler, but the toddler wins on social learning, because this is the thing that humans are uniquely really good at. So ultimately, humans are, I would say, veneer theory doesn't really hold, because we as people are able to build amazing things in institutions. It's really hardwired into us that we can come together and we can do things in a very pro-social and positive way. But we all know that there's also a lot of pretty awful stuff happening in the world, so that has to be explained for. And one of the explanations for that is oxytocin, which is one of those hormones that we mentioned that is more prominent in the kind of domesticated or friendlier version of a species. And oxytocin is often known as the love hormone. It is a kind of a friendliness thing. It is about being with other people and the good vibes that come from that. But from experimentation, we've learned that oxytocin is about the in-group. Oxytocin isn't going to apply to you for people who are far away, who you've never spent time with or heard of or interacted with. It doesn't apply to the other. And this is really important and a really important finding in the shock experiment. These are the 4 prompts that are given to the participant by the researcher who's in the room telling them to administer the shocks. If the person stops administering shocks, the first thing you say is, please continue. Then you say, the experiment requires that you continue. And then the other 2. If you get to the last one, the person almost always disobeys. They say, no, fuck that, I'm out. The most effective of these 4 lines is the second one. The experiment requires that you continue. And the reason is, like from interviewing people who've been through this process, is that if you can get the participant on your side to believe that they are on the side of science and they are working with you as the researcher, as a fellow researcher, then they're willing to keep going for a while longer. If you can't get them on side, it's not going to happen. And there's also, like they have shown, here's how people talk themselves out of the experiment. And there's discussions about that. So ultimately, the shock experiment is not good news for humanity, but it is important to understand what we should take from it, which is that it's not about obedience, it's about conformity. It's about being in the same tribe as other people, because the oxytocin doesn't apply to people outside our tribe. And that is a big part of why do people do horrible things. It's because they see the other as the other. And that brings us back to Liar Game. Liar Game is a scenario or an engineered set of scenarios where there's a lot of dealing with the other and a lot of opportunity for betrayal and for doing mean things that are going to saddle people with debt and put them in an awful situation. But Liar Game fundamentally rejects veneer theory. And the way it does that is by having now, in that game, who is someone who doesn't go along with all the norms and the expectations of humans are very fundamentally selfish inside, as Dawkins and many others would say. It's not a story about these super intelligent chess players and these vicious gamblers and all that stuff. And that is the style of One Outs, which is the author's previous work. But now the other characters have their own motivations. And when they play Liar Game, some of them, you start to see that their motivations are not just winning. They try to align with what's right from time to time. And now's presence is really upsetting for some of the way the game might otherwise unfold. But that leaves us with the question of, well, even if Liar Game is rejecting veneer theory, what's that got to do with all of the anti-establishment stuff we were talking about earlier? And in this respect, I think Liar Game does an incredibly disciplined thing, in that it starts its story by focusing on all the high-stakes game stuff. And behind the scenes, we have the Liar Game tournament office. And we get to see them from time to time. Now, this is a small detail I appreciate. They updated the manga or the anime to use smartphones because they figured the old phones would not be suitable for a modern audience. But somehow there's still this big computer mainframe from NASA in the 60s in the background while they're doing all the monitoring and everything. It's like, okay, and it doesn't, maybe it's a low res there, but that was a bit of fun. So the Liar Game Tournament Office are running all of these games, which are actually experiments. They're running experiments to explore veneer theory and to see how do people respond when they're faced with a lot of pressure, and do humans ultimately come together for the greater good, or do they descend into like being dogs tearing at each other? And we learn, and this is getting into spoilery territory for the ending of Liar Game, we learn, I'll take a moment if people want to cover their ears or something. I know you want to hear all about it, it's okay. So Liar Game, we learn, is actually the title of a book. It is the title of a fictional book within this universe, written by somebody who was in a country which had an oppressive government, and he was trying to write about how do we get people to rise up and challenge that authoritarian government, but he had to deal with censorship, so he did it in kind of subtle ways, more gentle ways, to get his stuff published. And Liar Game, the book, did not get published, but some people got copies of it and brought it over to Japan. And the series of experiments, so to speak, are social experiments done in a format that is much more digestible to a broader audience. So it's not just feel-good stories, like it is a series of games that feel very high stakes and very dynamic and very interesting. And yeah, there are unwilling participants. But ultimately, it's a series of experiments that you can put in front of the public and have them see that actually veneer theory doesn't quite hold. And that's really interesting. So here's how Liar Game kind of comes to an end, is the final game gets played. I'm not going to spoil what happens in the final game, because part of the joy of this, of the story, is getting to see all the strategies and all the cool stuff that the characters come up with and getting to meet them. There's our book. So the Liar Game Tournament Office have been recording all the experiments in secret. I don't know how you record things in secret these days. I mean, you can kind of see these if they're in a room, but I guess the Liar Game Tournament Office were recording everything in secret. And they approach the players after the final game and they say, listen, this is what motivated us to do it. This was the set of ideas behind it. We're backed by kind of philanthropists who want to put something into the world that can help people to see a different side of the way that humans can behave, because it's really difficult to overturn veneer theory. It's really embedded in a lot of people. So what we'd like to do is we'd like to use kind of voice changers and blur out your faces and all that stuff. We'll put masks on, and we want to put that out into the world and share it with people to make a difference. And the participants in the game overwhelmingly say, yeah, okay, that makes sense, do that. So they spend a couple of weeks brushing up the footage. And the moment comes when it's time to upload the videos. So they pick their day, they pick their time, and now the Liar Game, I guess you would call this the live action version of Liar Game somehow, like the produced version of Liar Game, goes out to the world. And then 20 minutes. 20 minutes is all they get before the videos are pulled. Video unavailable, gone. Scraped from all the platforms. And that's it. The players go back to their daily lives. The Liar Game Tournament Office dissolves. And it comes to be known that trying to distribute this type of material is not something that the platforms or the authorities want. It is a bitter, bitter end. And what I love about it is that it shows Liar Game is this series that's planned, and it's in serialization for 10 years. And it is this story about ultimately breaking free from a set of dynamics which are keeping society controlled in a way, because as long as you have people believing in veneer theory, or it's informing how they think or how they choose things, that's a population that's a lot easier to control than people who know that coming together can accomplish things. People who know that hope actually leads to results, and people who know that it's possible to create change. So the author identifies like this is the strand that I want to have running through my story, and I'm willing to play it very slow paced all the way 10 years of writing this until the final volume where I get to do this reveal. That's fucking cool. So it really is a manga and a story that is against the contemporary Japanese government of its time. We just didn't know it back when it was first being serialized and first being authored. That's pretty incredible. And there's a couple of things I'd like to share about why Liar Game is so interesting and why I love it so much. And this ending made it one of my favorite manga overall. I mean, the Yokuya and now dynamic, I think, was a really interesting thing that you don't see in characters very often. But the way this ending was paced and handled was a real surprise, and I really loved it. I like Liar Game because it's a psychological game manga where the overarching theme is actually psychology. That's really rare. You don't get to see that very much. It's definitely a critique of veneer theory, which is not something that many manga would go into or explore. It's rooted in a context which is very anti-establishment for Japanese government. It's about changing society. And it does that in, again, this like very disciplined way. It has an adversary, seemingly, but that adversary ultimately becomes broader society, which is quite subtly done and very cleverly delivered. It's not a game about these human players who are just like, you have, in any of these chess games, like you have these schmucks, these people who are just there as to be foils for the chess masters. Liar Game doesn't really have schmucks in the same way. Those people end up being in the game for multiple rounds, and they start to like build loyalty with now and with other characters on the basis of how people play. So it's not a one and done in that sense. And to give a direct quote from Shinobu Kaitani in 2026, as the anime was being put out to launch, "This is a story about the importance of trust." And I think it really delivers on that. Now, in terms of the lineage, I mean, where does Liar Game go next? Because we've talked about the things that contributed to Liar Game. Yes, there's the gambling manga. Yes, there's the Japanese political situation. Yes, there's veneer theory and a lot of the psychology that was clearly informing how this the story came together. There was a live action of this, which covered a short bit at the start of the story. There's an anime airing right now. And I have to express my caution about the anime, because if the anime doesn't get to the ending, then it was just a high-stakes game thing. And people maybe don't read the real story and get the real conclusion from it, which would be a real shame. So there's a little bit of cynicism in me about what does it mean to adapt Liar Game without adapting all of Liar Game and letting people see the real thing. In terms of where stories might be told in future that have learned from Liar Game, well, we know that one of them is Squid Game. We know that because the author of Squid Game said, Liar Game was one of my inspirations alongside Battle Royale. So Squid Game definitely takes inspiration from Liar Game. I wouldn't call it something that is necessarily angry at the contemporary government. So it's more perhaps taking from the gambler, the high stakes game side of things, rather than the very nuanced political commentary. And there's also a film, which I have heard of, called The Platform, which is a 2019 French-Spanish film, which apparently leans into some Liar Games themes, so I want to check that out at some point. But as for the lineage, there's probably a whole bunch more that I don't know. So if you see me around the convention, please feel free to come over, say hello, and share your own thoughts on Liar Game and what made it such a cool manga. Because for me, these are some of the things that play that role in the lineage. There may be others that have followed since, and I would love to hear about them. So folks, thank you so much for your time and attention today. That was the lineage of Liar Game. Woo! And we are finishing just under time.